Using Access 2013 to rapidly build enterprise SharePoint applications session. So welcome to my talk. How many of you were in my talk on Monday on forums? Oh, quite a few of you. All right, great. Well, welcome back for more abuse. So on the talk on Monday, I just had a little bit of time to start to get into the Access 2013 stuff, and not much, but a little bit. So we'll dive more deeply into that topic specifically in this session. And that really is the entire purpose of this talk, is really all around Access 2013. So this is me. My name's Darvish. I am with Microsoft. I'm a SharePoint technical specialist. Have written a couple books for Microsoft Press that are out on the table out there if you want to check those out. And there's my email and my Twitter. So I am from the States. Is there anyone else in here from the U.S.? Anyone else? Brave enough to, oh, Ted's here. All right, hey, Ted. So since a few of my colleagues are in here, we probably won't pick on the Americans too much. I almost have an excuse to be able to do that, even though I was raised in the Midwest of the U.S. I'm, as you may guess from my name, I'm not exactly an Iowa boy by genetics. So my father was from Iran and moved to the States back in the 60s to go to school. Met my mother, who was a small town country girl. And I was the firstborn son, so they named me Darvish. And my little brother, who looks much more sort of Middle Eastern, like my dad, his name is Mike. And, I've just come to accept it, I guess. It's fine. So anyway, so you can call me D. That's my friends just call me D. You're welcome to just call me D or Darvish. Happy to communicate with anyone afterwards on email or on Twitter. So I'll put that slide back up again later. How many of you come in here today thinking that Access basically is a pile of rubbish? Yeah? If you feel free, go ahead. Yeah, quite a few. It was almost all male that raised their hand. Is there a reason for that? No? Anyone else? Thoughts on Access? Complete rubbish or just kind of rubbish? Well, we'll see if we can change your perception in this session today, all right? I'm assuming there's a reason why you guys are here. I'm actually curious, for those of you who said, I basically think Access is a pile of garbage, what would bring you to this talk? Yes, sir.
Well, I think that in the earlier versions, it's been very difficult to scale and move once the whole solution started to expand.
Yes.
Become big and business critical. But in your abstract, you said something about the SQL database and stuff like that.
So the abstract I wrote brought you to the session, is what you're saying. Yes. And by the way, so on that note, and then I'll take a couple more. On that note, I'm never offended if people get up and leave my talk, right? If you decide 5 minutes into this thing that it's just not your cup of tea, get out. So anyway, thank you for that. Thank you for that input. That's a great reason to attend this session. There was a hand over here. Yes, sir.
Replacement of InfoPath and SharePoint design for businesses rather than SharePoint design for SharePoint.
Okay, so what was the very first part that you said?
Replacement for InfoPath.
Replacement for InfoPath, okay, and for forums and. All right, that's a good reason to sit in this talk for sure. I think there was one over here. Did someone else have one?
We've got a lot of just access databases popped up all over the business, and obviously trying to bring them under control as they become business critical, and then all of a sudden something goes wrong. It's the first we ever heard of database ever existing.
Yes. Okay. So for those of you who couldn't hear on the other side, basically his comment was we have a lot of access databases that have sort of sprawled throughout the organization and created some challenges in terms of the data management, I suppose. And that is the typical reason why when IT folks come to these talks that they're like that you have the attitude that you do about access. And I've been at Microsoft for a long time, so I've heard it all and I completely understand it. In terms of the management. And so if that is part of the challenge, then this talk will be a good one for you to understand why this is a different tool than it was in the past. You kind of have to forget about what you know as far as access as a tool in order to really appreciate it in terms of SharePoint 2013, because it really is quite a different beast. And, and the things that it enables are pretty compelling. So this talk, I'm going to go through Access in terms of its integration with SharePoint primarily. I'm not going to really spend a whole lot of time talking about the Access client-side stuff, other than in terms of what you would design for SharePoint. So that really is the focus of this talk, is around Access 2013 services for SharePoint and the apps that you can use it for. Any other comments before I move on? Okay? No? All right, great. Thank you for the input. So, and I apologize for those of you over here. I'll have to scoot over once in a while so you can see my slides. The mission of Access is to quickly create business value with server-based apps. That's kind of there's the marketing for you. That's really what we're trying to do, and hopefully you'll be able to see throughout this session that actually is a reality with this version of Access. So, in 2013, what we sort of set out to do was to create a version of Access where the user, or the power user, or the site owner, or whatever term you want to give yourself in this case, can quickly build custom apps that adhere to the SharePoint app model without necessarily needing to have any coding skills. So you can quickly create app templates for your sites. You can create what we call table templates, and I'll show you those when I do the demo. You can maintain your existing desktop databases, but on the server side, and we'll talk more about that. You get the app experience without code, and you get SharePoint Access apps delivered in the browser. Right, so one of the most compelling things about this as a solution is if you are needing to rapidly build an app in SharePoint that is going to serve multiple audiences, people with iPads, non-traditional Windows desktop users, etc., these apps will work fine across most of those devices as long as they have HTML5 support. Okay? So that is part of the appeal, is in many cases you can just build one of these and test it on a non-Windows device, and it will generally just work fine. And the UI, because it's all SharePoint app, it's works fine in the browser. Talk more about that here in a moment. So I'm going to start off the session with just a very quick little demo so that you can actually see this before I dive into more technical details. So let me hop out of slides and come over to my browser. All right, so I'm in a SharePoint 2013 site that this happens to be one that's SharePoint Online, so I'm connected to Office 365 right now, and we'll talk more later about the differences between Access services in the cloud versus on-prem. But if you haven't seen this before, when you go into a site in 2013, you can add an app, right? Using the little charm menu. When you add an app, one of the options that you will have somewhere in your list of apps, in my case it's on the second page, is this Access app. So when you want to create one of these apps, there are multiple starting points that you can go to, and I have a slide that actually covers the different places where you can start to build an Access app. For now, I'm just going to pretend that I'm going to select one of these. I'm going to do an Access app, and it's going to just prompt me for a name. But when I do this, I want you to also notice right here it says you can either create one from scratch or you can upload an access.app package. And so I'll save the details for later, but basically this entire process adheres to the new app model, and so it can be packaged up. Your database application can be packaged up as a .app package and moved to other sites very easily, or published in your catalog. Okay? Any questions? Once I've done that, and for the sake of time, I've already actually generated one here. Or maybe I haven't. We'll just go ahead and do one. We'll just call this SPC Evo test. And so what will happen is SharePoint, in this case SharePoint Online, will go ahead and generate a new Access app for us. And so you can see this one right here, and it's grayed out because it's actually generating on the server side right now. Now, what happens behind the scenes when I do this is where it gets interesting for the technical folks on what it's actually doing. And I'm going to go through the details of what's happening here so that you completely understand this. In this session, you will understand the user side of it a little bit, and you will also understand the IT and the technical side. That's my goal anyway. So it looks like it's done. So when I click on that, if I'm the site owner or the designer in this case, I come into my new app. I'm in the browser here. I really won't have anything yet because I haven't actually done anything. And it just basically the message is, hey, you've created an app, and do you want to open this up in the Access client to start adding tables and data? Or, well, not data, to start adding tables. So I can do that, and I'll go ahead and select that, and I'll open it up. And you'll notice that I've been working in Firefox here, just to show that it's pretty browser agnostic. And when I get into Access, our starting point on this one was from the site, right? So this app is living in the site. We've not done anything with the app yet other than create an app with a name and open it up in Access. So when I open it up here in Access, basically it's going to prompt me to start adding some structure to this database, right? And this probably looks familiar or sort of familiar to those of you who've used Access before. In here, the primary things I can do when I build one of these from scratch, like I just did here, is I can go in and I can add tables. And you'll notice when you add a table in the UI, we actually make some suggestions on what kinds of tables you might make. So something related to services or selling or orders or persons. When I select one of those items, what Access, the client, does is it looks for templates that table templates, what we call them, that match that kind of category. So, for example, if I selected sell, it would have a bunch of things related to selling products and orders and whatever. And that way, we give you a very nice structure to start off with. And if you're just learning this, if you've never done this before, I would certainly encourage you to do it that way, because then you can look at the structure of the tables behind the scenes and see how it actually works. Trying to build one completely from scratch can be challenging if you have never done an Access application before. So I'd recommend starting out with the templates. I'm going to show more templates later. While I'm on the screen, the other thing I would point out, those of you on that side might not be able to see it, but it says create a table from an existing data source. So the options that I have there are Access, Excel, SQL, text files, and SharePoint lists. Now I'm going to talk more about data connections later in the talk, but the two that I'll spend some time on later for sure are, I'll talk a little bit about Excel and a little bit about SharePoint lists. So if you have some existing data you want to pull into your app, you have the option to do that. Okay, let me pause there and see if there are any questions at this point. No? All right. Yes, sir.
Maybe too early, but if you use a SharePoint list, is it two separate things, or are they connected together?
If I select the SharePoint list, are they two separate things, or are they connected together? Or are they the same? Okay. So, or are they the same thing? Right. If I connect to the SharePoint list, it essentially is just it's a lookup table or a drop-down list for my app. So it leaves I actually have the option. Let me say that again. You have the option to either import the data from the SharePoint list or to make a real-time connection to it. You make the choice. Okay? And I will get into a little more depth on that. But did that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So you actually make the choice. Now the downside is one of the limitations, unfortunately, with this version. This is we're going to update this with a few new features here pretty soon. But one of the limitations is that the SharePoint lists are currently read-only, so I can use them for lookups and drop-downs in my Access apps, but I can't write back to the list yet. Okay, you'll understand a little bit more why when I get to the architecture. So let me just add. Let me do a quick search for. Let's try person. Or actually, they've already put it there for me. So when I do person, I get a number of options of the kinds of tables that I might generate here. Let's just do a simple people one. And Access is now, the client is communicating with, in this case, SharePoint Online, and more specifically with SQL Azure. Because when I select the option to create a table, which I now have one here called people, let me open my navigation pane, I just created this. And you can see that the client went out and generated a number of fields, and in this case, 3 views or forms by group, people data sheet, and people list. So all that was generated for me simply by selecting that one template. Now the cool thing is if I need multiple templates, I can select multiple templates here, and it goes ahead and puts them into the same database on the back end for me and generates all the necessary connections and retains all of the data logic that would be necessary to make sure that you don't end up with duplicates and things like that. So there's a lot of power here in the way the client is interacting with the UI. Questions on that? All right, go ahead.
Is it possible for templates to be created to help the users creating them later on?
Yeah, so you do have the option to create your own table templates. Yes. So now this is where a lot of the real work was done, in that the fact that once I get done creating this new people app, right? We didn't really customize it for the sake of time. I'm not going to spend a lot of time customizing the app, but in order to begin using this, all I need to do in Access is click this new Launch App button. And what will happen is Access, again, communicates with the server side and says, all right, it's time to actually build this app and to package it up and put it on the site. And you saw that happen very quickly. So I did that in real time up to SharePoint Online. And I'm now in the site where I initially generated the app, right? Remember I went in and said I want a new app? I'm now in that site, but the context of where I'm at is an immersive experience in the Access app. So we always give users this back to site link here so they can always easily navigate back to the team site or whatever it is they're working in. But when I'm in this Access app, it's a fully immersive HTML5 experience for the user. So now I could go ahead and start adding data in here. So I won't fill out the whole thing for the sake of time, but we'll just add one in, and you can see that I now have a record. I have a data sheet view on this app that I can go in and edit in the browser if I want to. I have a filter that allows me to do by group, so I added John Doe under the business category, but I could have people in personal categories and other categories. So those 3 views were just added automatically for me. So those of you that have InfoPath background, you start to see a lot of possibilities with this for sort of the new world of app building in SharePoint 2013, that this is not a replacement for every use case that InfoPath was involved in, but it does come in very handy in building forms with multiple views and some business logic on them. Okay, so that's, you saw me do that whole thing, right? If I hadn't been talking, I could have literally built a working app within 30 seconds or so and actually had something that was fairly useful. Now from there, in the app, if you have the right level of permissions, you get the charm where you'll get the option to customize this in Access. And when I do that, we'll go ahead and open it up. It will open up that app in the client. Now I already had it open, but we're back in it now. And now I can start editing it, adding some custom fields if I need to, adding some business logic, macros, etc. All right, so that's a really quick overview of the high level of the way that it works. Questions, comments? Yes. The $1 million question. So her question was, do we have workflow integrated with that? And the answer is, unfortunately, no. If you were in my talk the other day, we talked about this a little bit. By far, the #1 requested feature from customers that have seen this so far and wanted to use this is workflow integration. So there probably is some things you could do if you're a developer to do some workflow integration with this, because the data is available in the SQL database on the back end. But from a user standpoint, the type of people that are going to be building these, power users or site owners, there's no out-of-the-box workflow integration. It is high on our list to add that pretty soon. That is the #1 requested feature. Okay, so I imagine that we will have that done hopefully in relatively short term. Okay?
For a licensing point of view, do you require, or anyone that uses this, would you require an access client license?
So he asked me a licensing question, for those of you in the back that couldn't hear. When I normally kick people out of my sessions for asking me licensing questions. No, so I'm not always the best guy to ask licensing questions to, because it's not really my forte. But you shouldn't Well, you need a SharePoint license because what's generating the UI in the browser is Access Services, which is part of SharePoint. So they don't necessarily need Access client side, right? But they would need a license of some sort to use it. And the challenge with the licensing now is it gets very nuanced depending on your scenario, because with SharePoint Online, there are options now for external users and all these other things where this might be very useful for an external user, someone not inside your organization, but the licensing gets a little beyond what my licensing skills are. Short answer is they need whoever it is that's using it does need a SharePoint license because it's looking to see who I am as a SharePoint user to get there, right?
The lease privilege permission would be site owner. How could someone from outside the organization be making that?
Well, no, I think that's a good point, but I think his question is, and I'll restate it for those of you who didn't hear, for designing and building apps, yes, you need a higher level of privileges, but I think his question was if I have a user who wants to fill out an app or a form, what level of license do they need? But you're right, in order to generate the app, you'd need the appropriate level of permissions on the site, which would probably be site owner. Yep, good questions.
You put one row of data a few seconds ago.
Yes.
Where is the physically stored?
Fantastic question. Can you hold it for just a couple of minutes? I'm going to go into a significant amount of detail about that question. Yes. Do you know where it's not?
It's not in the SharePoint list. It's not.
Now, how do you know that?
I don't know. You told me.
I told you that. Did I tell you that? I haven't gotten to that slide yet. I'm not sure why I told you that. Okay, yeah. So I'm going to go into detail about that. So if you don't mind bearing with me for just one moment. Okay, one more question, then I'll move on. Yes and no. You can't really do a whole lot of branding to the app itself, but whatever the site theme is where the app is generated will inherit that site theme. So the apps will just automatically inherit the site theme. Okay? Oh, yeah. No, you can do that, but as far as like full branding, we limit what you can do with that. But yes, I'll show you how you can, yes, there's quite a bit you can do actually in terms of customizing the look and the feel and adding new views and whatnot. But whatever the theme is of the site, the colors, graphics, that's what we inherit. All right, great questions. Back to slides here for just a few minutes. Okay, so how does that work? Everything that we just saw can be summed up fairly simply with this slide. The Access client was used to design the app. Now, we started building the app from the site, but we can start it from the client as well, and I'll show you that in the next demo. So we use the Access client to design the app. That is communicating with the Access Services app that's part of SharePoint. Okay? And then when we run the app in the browser, it's JavaScript and HTML forms. And so what that means is there is almost, and in most cases, no communication necessary to go back to the server side with these. And so that's by design so that on the client side they feel very, very quick. All right, so that's running on the browser side, and SharePoint's handling the communication. Now the data is stored in SQL. So depending on your situation, if you're running this on premise, it will be SQL 2012. If you are in the cloud, it's automatically stored for you in SQL Azure, and you don't actually need to worry about that. When I said, give me a new app, and then I added tables, right? I added that people or person table or whatever it was. What happens is Access Services communicates with SQL, whatever version of SQL you have back here, and it generates in SQL a database. and that database contains all of the views, all of the tables, all of the stored procedures that are necessary, or anything else that would be required. You, as the app owner, never actually see any of that happen. So the database is generated in SQL, it sits there, but Access Services handles all of the communication between SharePoint and SQL. So the row of data I created, to answer your question, sits over here in SQL. All right? Now that has advantages and disadvantages in terms of the SharePoint world, right? People are used to having things in lists in SharePoint. This is a little bit different take on how to store data in SharePoint. There are a number of advantages to it too, though, and I'll talk some about that. Okay, so that slide usually generates a question or two.
SQL versions, you've got 2012 up there, is 2008 R2 acceptable?
Nope. His question was, is SQL 2008 R2 acceptable? And it's not. It is for SharePoint, but not for Access Services, unfortunately. And I'm going to get into a little more detail on requirements for an on-premise installation. Access Services is not as simple as just going in and turning on a site feature, unfortunately. There is a little bit of work for on-prem setup of Access Services. This is one of those use cases where I'm a really big fan of SharePoint Online, right? Because I just go in and say, I just want some Access Services stuff, and I don't really have to do anything. It's just there waiting for me. So from a, well, anyway, I think you understand.
Are there any sizing criteria for linking to Azure? Any limitations?
It's scalability limits well, in the cloud, not really, other than what we.
Commercially, if we're putting large databases using this technique out there.
Nope, this is designed to, I mean, this has use cases where it makes sense, and there are many where it does not. But from a scalability standpoint, especially if you're doing it, in SQL Azure, you can scale this quite high, right? So the primary scalability limitation is going to be your SharePoint farm and your SQL instance. But yes, it's designed to do large-scale apps. Much larger than Access Client was ever designed to do, right? Even though people pushed its limit way beyond what it was ever intended for. This actually is designed for those scale, for that kind of scale. Yes?
You need a SharePoint Enterprise Cal or one of the 365 SKUs.
Say it a little louder.
You need a SharePoint Enterprise Cal or one of the 365 SKUs for the
Okay, so if you're running on-prem Enterprise Cal, if you're running in the cloud, I think it just comes with most of the SKUs. So maybe another reason to consider SharePoint Online, which I was initially skeptical, but now I'm quite a big proponent of. Was there one more, or maybe not? Okay, so that's at a high level. That's the architecture, and I'm going to get a little more in detail on the storage and some security things here in a bit. I don't really think I need to spend much time on this slide because I think based on your feedback at the beginning of the session, you guys kind of understand the issues here. Classic desktop applications were very popular back in the day, but they were very easy for end users to build bad applications that ended up being mission critical. And the challenge was that you had to put it out on the clients, and there were all these concerns that IT folks have, which is why Access has the bad reputation it does. Access Services, clearly a pretty different story, right? I mean, the Access client is only needed by people who are actually designing the apps. You have centralized access control, you have centralized security, you can share the apps very easily, you can scale it up, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot of reasons why this is compelling for the right use cases. So the user experience, these are sort of the pillars for the user experience. We wanted it consistent, we wanted it fast, and by consistent, there's trade-offs with that. You'll see when I show you the designer, consistency requires simplicity in the designer, right? And that is one of the challenges with InfoPath and some of the other tools is that people could accidentally sort of create a big mess. Access really sort of helps guide you in the right direction. So it's consistent, it's fast, we really wanted to focus on content first, and we wanted to make it very intuitive, even if you've never built one before. The user interface, as I mentioned earlier, is pretty enticing. You'll see some more of that here in a minute. It runs entirely in the browser. There's no server-side rendering necessary. We do inherit the SharePoint themes, but we do provide limited customizations. So this slide, I'm going to sit down so that the folks over there can hopefully see most of this. This is the model of the interface, right? So the first thing is, when a user goes into an Access app and they're in this immersive thing in the browser, they're going to pick a table that they want to work with, if there's more than one. So in this case, I've got 3 tables. The user selects a table, and when they select the table, then they're probably going to select one of the views. So in this case, we have 3 views that are generated by default in Access. We can add more if we need to. And if they need to, they can search and filter. That searching and that filtering is just built in. No code necessary to do that. And the level of functionality there is pretty robust. And so even if I have no clue how to build in search or filters into an application in 2013, it handles that for me. Number 4, I can edit items, which is, of course, is what we would expect the user to mostly be doing. And we give them this toolbar when we generate an Access app that is very consistent. You can add buttons to this if you want to, but you get 5 buttons essentially here, and I'll talk more about later what each of these do. But I can go in and I can add and I can save items. Now those 5 things combined together essentially comprise the user experience of one of these apps. It's pretty simple, it's pretty consistent, and as you hopefully got a little taste of, it's fairly quick. Now, the next thing then is to make sure that you understand, if you understand the UI model, I need my mouse back. There we go. From a customization standpoint, as I mentioned, you can add tables, you can change the icons on the list of tables over there if you'd like to. You can change fields. You can edit the layout. So the gentleman in the back asked what, the layout. I can move those fields around anywhere I want to and resize them, those kinds of things. But there is a grid behind the scenes that keeps everything in track for you. So it's surprising the first time you try it. You move a field around and it snaps back to where it's supposed to be, right? And it's a little disconcerting at first, but once you figure it out, it's actually very useful because you can quickly design something that looks like it was actually designed by a professional forms designer, which I supposedly am, but sometimes my forms look awful. And then you can add buttons if necessary as well. So that's kind of the customization of the UI portion from a power user standpoint. Go ahead.
What about code behind the button? Is it written in JavaScript or pure Access code, or I don't know?
We don't give you the ability to do code behind on these apps right now. Yeah, no code, as the title of the session said. No, it's a good question. That is also one of the most requested features in that, like, okay, this is great. Now, if I'm a professional developer and my business analyst creates one of these and they give it to me and they say, okay, it does 90% of what I need it to do, but I need you, Mr. Developer, to add a few things. We don't have that yet, but we will. Okay? So workflow and being able to customize with code are a couple of the features we're working on. Access Services fits into this sort of model of building apps for SharePoint, and it sits at the far end of that continuum, right? So on this, we have at one end, we have the power user. At the other end, we have the professional developer. The 3 primary tools that we talk about in terms of building new, the cloud apps for SharePoint 2013 are Access Services at the one end, Napa, Office 365 development tools, sort of cross boundaries there a little bit, and then of course Visual Studio 2012 for developers. So that's sort of where it fits into the model of app development. So, all right, earlier you saw me go to a site and add an app, right? There are multiple entry points for building one of these apps. So I can do the add app. I can take an existing app package and import it into my site. very easily. If someone else has built a great app and I want to add it, they can give me the .app and I can do that. Or I can do it from the Access client. And you saw earlier you can use table templates and you can import existing data. So when I get to the next demo, and I am keeping an eye on time because I know you guys are probably anxious for lunch. When I get to the next demo, I will show you generating from the client side because we haven't done that. And I think that's actually where it's the most interesting. Once you've generated an Access app and you think it's really compelling, you can publish it to the SharePoint store if you so choose, right? And the option is there to publish it to the SharePoint store, or if you have an internal corporate catalog and you want to publish it there and allow your other site owners to consume it, it's very easy to do that. In order to save your app as a package, that's built right into the client UI, so you can do a save as, and you'll have a save as package option in there. What's generated is a .app file. You can take that, save it, email it, whatever, bring it into another SharePoint site, assuming the person has rights to do that, and you'll have your app in another site. So very portable, very virtualized, sort of inherently sandboxed, right? So that these things can be reused. Okay, so I had, in my session the other day, I had a few questions about security. I'm not going to dwell on this too long, but I just wanted to make sure folks came back that I spent some time on it and got their questions answered. Because it is a different sort of model than what some of the other SharePoint features use, so it's worth talking about for a moment. When you build a new app in Access, the person who is building the app needs to have the appropriate level of permissions, and we use NTOff to do that. And does anyone know the reason why we do that? No? Any guesses? Does anyone know what SQL does not currently support? Pardon? Claims? Right. So we're using NTOff because we have to do that in order to communicate with SQL, because Access Services is doing a lot of work hand in hand with SQL 2012 on the other side of this. So that happens there. I might have a build out on this actually. Yeah. So you have the Access interface down here, the client, and when you go to add a new app, so we're now adding app number 4, NTOff communicates, builds, and generates that new database in SQL for us. And then when the user consumes the app, edits data, adds a new record, what happens is their site permissions that they already have are the same as the app essentially, and the app uses SQLoff to communicate with that specific database. So this authorization is not dependent upon the user specifically, right? Because what happens is I might have 100 users who have access to the site to add new records, but I only have one set of credentials to do the SQL authorization on the back end here. Now SQLoff, sometimes people get a little leery about that, but in this case, no human actually knows what this is, right? This is all behind the scenes. Access Services is handling this communication with the SQL database. So there's nobody that has the SQL services account and password other than the system, and that's hidden. All right, so that's at a high level the way security works on there. And then I guess the only other thing I should probably say about that is when the user comes in via the browser and they communicate with one of the apps, we look at what their level of permissions within the particular site is, and then we use role-based authorization over to SQL to determine what level of access they get to the data in that app. So this helps us have scenarios where I may have a large contingent of users who are read-only to that particular app. They can open it, they can go through the records and look at it, search and filter, whatever, but they can't actually edit or add new records. So we do take that into consideration and provide a way to handle that. Okay? You guys doing okay?
Does that mean that we have the app applies to all tables?
Yes. The question is, does that mean that permission level they have applies to all tables? Yes, and so that is one of the sort of things that is a little different in this case is that if I have permission to the app to add new records, then I basically have permission to the app to add new records, and we're not limiting once you're in there by a specific table. I'm pretty sure I'm right about that. I'm 99% sure I'm right about that, because what happens is the access is actually granted using SQL auth to the database. So for those of you who are database folks who are interested in this, I'll just put this up, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but this gives you the mapping of when I do something in these Access apps, what does it actually mean on the back end in SQL? So, for example, the Access app is a database, as we've talked about. A table is still a table. An Access field is just a SQL field. It gets a little more interesting as you get more granular. So a data type in SQL is not always match Access exactly, but Access Services handles the renaming of anything that we might need to do there in terms of data types, in terms of expressions. Queries are the same thing as a SQL view. And Access data macros are automatically converted into stored procs on the back end for us. So what's cool is when you build logic into your Access app using the client, you don't really need to be a rocket scientist to do that. It's not that hard, right? I add a button and I add a macro that says, when I click on the button, go to the next view, or do a pop-up window, or whatever it does. Access Services handles the conversion of that to a stored procedure in SQL, or trigger. Okay? If you're going to do on-prem, you do need to do a little work, and I don't want to dwell on this too long because IT folks probably get frustrated, but SharePoint Online is a great solution. So what you can do is you can have Access Services use the same SQL instance that SharePoint does. If it's 2012, we generally recommend against that for scalability reasons, because if you're going to do the kind of scale that the gentleman asked about up here, you probably want a separate instance of SQL 2012 for Access Services. That is the recommended way to do it. So in this case, it's a fairly standard SharePoint installation, except you need some extra bits there to make that happen. Now, it is just complicated enough, or challenging enough, I guess, that we did write a white paper specifically on this topic, and I do encourage you to, the link will be available on the slides. This is the one, if you're going to do an on-prem install, I would definitely encourage you to read this before you set to work. Okay? If you're in the cloud, it's just there, ready to be used. Okay. Any questions before I do one last quick demo? Anyone know what's for lunch today? Food? It's probably a good. That's probably a pretty good guess. Fish?
Does that get me a book?
Get you something. Free lunch. All right. Good try. Let's see. Let's go over to the Access client here real quick. Close this one down. So if I am in Access and I want to generate a new app for SharePoint, you saw earlier I could go to the site, or I can just come to Access and I can say I want a custom web app. If you do the custom web app, you essentially end up with the same thing that you got when you do it from the site, which is to say that you get a blank Access app on your site. I prefer to use some of the, at least when you're learning it anyway, to use some of the existing templates that are the app templates, right? Now you know the ones that are not app templates because they say desktop, contacts, desktop, whatever. You want to pick the ones that are not. So for example, let's just do contacts, it's a simple one. If I select contacts, this is the UI I get. So I'm sitting in the Access client and I want to create one called contacts. I'll just call this SP Evo contacts. And then I'm prompted to give it a SharePoint site where I want to actually publish this to. Now I'm not going to publish it to Microsoft. I'm going to publish this to my test tenant here, spc239.sharepoint.com. And once I've done that, I simply click Create. And Access communicates, the client side communicates with Access Services. In this case, it's in the cloud. Yes, sir. Say that one more time. Is the Access app being crawled by search? No. I don't think so. I'm almost sure that it's not because where the data is sitting in this a database. Now, it's just a SQL database. I don't think there's any reason. Well, I want to double check this. So let me just say there's a possibility we could just add it as a content source. I don't know why you couldn't. It is just a SQL database, but that's, I don't actually know. You probably earned a book. So you can email me afterwards for that. And I don't want to start the stump the presenter thing, so don't. One time per session. All right, okay, so here we are in our new Contacts app. Now remember, we generated this from the client side, and we're still in the client, but you can see the URL at the top of the Access client is pointing at my SharePoint site, and if I select my Contacts table, you can see this is what it generated for me in terms of fields and whatnot. And from here, I can go in and I can start doing things like adding more views. I can add macros that would do business logic here. And it does a lot of the same kinds of things that InfoPath does, right? I mean, that's, you guys know I've done a little InfoPath work in the past. And you can do a lot of the same kinds of declarative business logic. So when a user clicks here, throw up a message. When a user clicks here, move to a different part of the form. You know, those sort of things. Fill in a field based on what they put here. Things like that. Now, this one was created from the client side, and at this point, I can click the Launch App button, and what it will do is, for the designer, is it will take them right up to the app that they just created. So this is kind of fun because as you start to learn this, you can come here very quickly. You move back and forth between the client and the browser. I can go here and I can test it out and I can add things, and I realize that I'm missing some bit of functionality. Well, I'll just close that tab in my browser, go back to the client, and in this case, you know, maybe I'd like to edit this particular view and, you know, grab some fields and drag them around. Now you'll notice when I drag these around, you get a sense of what that UI experience is like. So it's sort of handling my uneducated guesses on where to put things on the fly for me. And it does a pretty good job of trying to figure out where I might want it. I can resize things. And then each of the fields has 3 buttons essentially that are available with them. One is, what is the data source of that field? The second is, what is the formatting of that particular field? We can add things like tooltips and input hints, which work fine in the browser, of course. And then last but not least, the Actions button. And this is where you go to add both action macros and data macros. So once you're in here and working with it, it's quite simple. You do still have, if you're familiar with how to use Access already, you do still have the ability to see the raw table. So if I go look at that, it's right here. That's probably looks very familiar to you. From here, I can, you know, just start adding things on the fly, changing it, making it look the way I want. And once I've done that, you know, I can click Save, or I can actually just launch. So yes, I'm going to save that. Go back and launch the app, and now you'll notice that it's moved around. Didn't do a very nice job of moving around, but I moved some fields around just to show you guys how easy that was. So it's literally, you know, it's almost that instant gratification of being able to change your app on the fly in the Access client and then publish it and then see your changes and see your app. Okay, that's a little bit of the design experience. Any questions about that? So if you take, the question I think is if you build an app and it's stored in a database, right, and then you package it as an app and you move it somewhere else, you're generating another database in wherever that location is. So the app within a site is tied to a database.
And what is the site? Is that the site collection or is it the sub-site or what is the site?
I'm not sure I understand the question. The site that you're in where you generate the app is where the database is linked to.
You're saying is there a SharePoint site, a traditional SharePoint site
Traditional.
associated to it as well?
Yes. Yes, because the app is living in the context of the site, and so the site is always the sort of container for the app.
But if you package it and take it elsewhere, it
Yeah.
creates a complete new instance of it.
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes.
What about if you associate other SharePoint content that isn't access? Can you mix the content so you have some stuff, libraries for instance, existing in SharePoint that are associated to the
Yeah, you could. I believe you have the option to make that transportable. So if I have a connection to a specific data source, I could take that with me when I package it. You actually have the option when you package it whether or not to take the data, and I believe that also will take if you have a connection to a list or something. Okay, great question. So let me just do a couple more things to wrap this up, and then we'll get you guys onto lunch. I thought I had a slide in here, but maybe I don't. There was one I wanted to talk about. Must have left it out. I'll just talk about it briefly. So when you look at the process of creating a new app, I pointed that out earlier that that you have the option to do an import from a variety of data sources. One of the questions that comes up, and it came up the other day in my talk, is that, so what about reporting? Many of the things that access services that you may have used in 2010 were left behind in this version. So reporting is one of them. So when you have the ability to bring old access databases to import them, in one of the demos that we do, sometimes we actually show bringing the entire Northwind, I think it was the old Northwind app, which had a lot of stuff in it, right? And importing that into Access Services, and it actually works quite nicely without making any changes. What does not work is that you don't actually end up getting things like the reports brought over with you. And so what I was going to talk about is, if this ever stops, the fact that when you generate a new app or new table, you have the option to bring in these data sources. There is an article on the Access Team blog, a fairly recent one, about how you can take the data from here and you can use Excel as a reporting mechanism for it. So you can take all the advantages of all the cool new reporting stuff that's in Excel 2013. So if you want to visualize the data that you are using in these apps, you don't do a traditional access report because we just don't support it on the server side. But what you can do is you can take all of the data and you can use all the data visualization reporting tools in Excel. Okay, so that's the best way to handle that. When you do an import from a SharePoint list, I can't remember if I showed you this screen earlier or not, but you get two options. I pointed at the site or the list, and then the first option says import this into a new table in the current database, or link to a data source by creating a linked table.
Does that include Excel services rather than the Excel client?
Well, once you use the Excel client, and then once you had built the visualization you wanted, you could publish it to Excel services, sure. But yeah, you need to get it into the client side first to actually do the work of pivot tables and whatnot. So the reason I pulled this up is just to show that there was a question earlier. You do have the option with the SharePoint list. If it's something that's fairly static, you can actually import it into your new Access app, or you can create a link. Now, the link is probably, in my opinion, the more useful one, because then you can use it as a way to drop down or provide lookups and filters and whatnot in your app.
Can you connect that to the term store?
No. No, however, if you think about the fact that term store, I was thinking BCS. So BCS is a little different question because you could have the data in a list and you could connect it to the list, right? Term store is another one of those things that's on the list of requested features that we haven't got to yet. That was, by the way, one of the biggest complaints, and someone brought it up again in the session I did the other day about InfoPath, that it makes no sense that I can't connect InfoPath to the metadata service, which I agree with. It's just something we never did. And I was pretty clear the other day, we probably won't ever do it in InfoPath. Access, that feature likely will happen at some point, because that just completely makes sense. Workflow obviously makes sense. Connecting to the term store makes sense. Being able to let developers customize this beyond what's available in the declarative UI makes sense. So there's a list of features that we're working on. Good question. I think I'll take one or two more, and then I'm going to let you guys go.
The access form, if you want to connect to a data source, which is not exactly under the site, but is under the site collection, is it possible?
Access form,
If you want to connect to a data source,
yeah.
it's not exactly under the site, but under the site collection, is it possible?
Yes, when I provide the URL here, it can be anywhere. The SharePoint list that I'm connecting to in this case, it doesn't matter where it is, as long as I have, what will happen is when I connect to a list, if it lives somewhere else, right, on a completely different site collection, or even in a different site collection, then I'm just prompted to whether or not I want to trust it. Pretty sure I'm right about that. I think I actually tried that before the talk. Yeah.
On the use cases, what is the thing that you provide yourself on the big lists? Because in SharePoint you can have lists with too many records in there. Would that be a replacement for that?
So your question is, would I choose to use an Access app because it can hold more records than a SharePoint list can? That may or may not, well, that may be true, but I don't think that's a good reason to choose it. I mean, SharePoint lists have gotten quite a bit more robust, but it is true that in a lot of cases, the Access apps, because it is the true app model that we're using here, it is very responsive, even with a large number of records, and that's mostly thanks to the power of SQL. So if someone said, I need you to rapidly build an app, and it doesn't really look like it's the kind of app that's going to need code, and by the way, we need it to be portable across devices, and we want to have HTML5 support, and we want to be able to do it, in 2 days, and here's the specs. I would certainly look at this as one of the ways to do it, because it really makes sense for those kinds of scenarios. So I think the answer to your question is maybe. And I'm just saying, I don't know that in and of itself would be a good enough reason to look at this, because there are so many options for creating apps, right? Custom code, just using lists, Access. But hopefully, as you saw here, there's a number of benefits to doing it with Access because it's so quick and easy, right? And what I end up with is a true, genuine app that potentially can have lots of functionality and lots of scalability. It's just you have to understand, what the limitations are, no workflow integration, et cetera, and hopefully you have a clear understanding of those after today. But yeah, I mean, if I was building it and I wanted to make sure it was super responsive, I definitely would look at this as one of the first things that I would consider. Yes, sir.
Is it possible to search the data with SharePoint Chat?
Using SharePoint Search? Yeah, so that question was asked earlier, and I think my answer was I haven't actually tried that myself, but I don't see why you couldn't add the SQL databases as a content source in SharePoint Search. You should be able to do that. I don't know, has anyone actually tried that in here yet? No? Okay. Final one.
What about the access reports?
About what?
Are they also present in the app model?
Access reports? Oh, one more time.
Access reports.
Access reports.
I need to print.
They're not brought in. If you imported an old Access app, they're not brought in. That's why I said, that's why we support Excel. All right, great. Enjoy your lunch, everybody. Thank you.